Welcome to the AtoZrunning Podcast, where we help runners thrive. I'm Andy.
And I am Zach, and up next, insights about toughness and resilience from Steve Magness' book, Do Hard Things. After that, World of Running updates about Oregon's new coach, marathoners beating milers, and more. Glad to have you with us once again, and keep in mind that if you would like to submit a question for our end of month episode, Q&A episode every month at the end of the month, and we answer your questions, all you need to do is ask us something and find a way to ask us that, and we'll put it on. The best way is to go to AtoZrunning.com/question and submit a question there via the contact form, and we'll respond as well as feature if we are able, feature your question at the end of the month.
Mm-hmm. We love to do it. So we have Rivertown races coming up in April. You've heard us talk about it, and we're going to talk about it again.
And because we are the training partner with the event, we're writing the training plans for anyone who wants to participate in the event and utilize those training plans. So you can find those after registering by just going to rivertownraces.com. That's where you can also then find information and register. They've got a 5K, a 10K, and a half marathon. It's April 22, and so it's good timing for those who are planning other races like in May as well. Speaking of good timing, you can also get 10% off your race entry by using code AtoZ10, ATOZ10. And so you get 10% off, which is great. You also get a custom training plan discount if you would like to take advantage of that, provided by yours truly. So in order to do all of those things, you just got to go to rivertownraces.com, register for the race, and check out the training page they've got there on their website, and we'll take good care of you.
Mm-hmm. Now on to our main topic.
Well, this topic is going to be an interesting examination on what seems to be a mundane concept. The idea of toughness, while it's a fairly plain and straightforward concept in most of our minds, Steve Magness argues in his writings that we tend to view it in an unproductive way. Meaning that when we think we're being tough, we often are doing things or making decisions that are not always in our own best interest. So anytime, I always appreciate this. He's got a blog post on the concept that's kind of promoting the key concept of his book, Do Hard Things, which we'll get into more of that here in a minute. But if you look at his blog post, what he's trying to do with that particular article is just identify the problem. And the story that he tells is when he was running a race. A half marathon. And at the time, this was by the way, I think he said that was the first time he'd ever raced longer than 10K, which is kind of fun. And if you're not familiar with Steve Magness, he's like a 4-minute miler, like very talented high school collegiate athlete. And then on the pro side of things, ended up going the coaching route instead of the competition route. But while he was coaching athletes, found himself also training at a high level because he was training with his runners. And so in the article, he outlines how, like many of us, he's in a scenario where he's running this half marathon, kind of just like an exhibition race. He was just doing it for fun because he knew he was fit, because he'd been training with his runners and things were in a good place there. And so he thought, well, let's test the fitness. Let's just kind of see what I can do. But in the back of his head, he thought, maybe I want to try to do like the Olympic trials side of things in the marathon. And he'd never raced long distances. So the half marathon was kind of his like, let's see how that feels and whether or not that gives me an indication of the potential here in this marathon, right? So he's racing a guy who, by the way, is a very talented runner as well, who went on to be a 2:12 marathoner down the line. And he's racing this guy in the half and finds himself late in the race in the like competitive groove. Like he really wants to win, of course. He's going head to head against another guy. Of course he would feel that way. So now let's put the context appropriately here. He really wants to win this race. This race ultimately means absolutely nothing. However, for his like long-term trajectory, it's just kind of for fun. And in that moment, late in the race, he starts to feel some Achilles soreness / pain. He kind of articulates it as initially it wasn't really like much. He just kind of ignored it. He's had a history of Achilles problems up to this point, so it was one of those things you just kind of expect to come and go here and there. But it kept getting worse.
Yeah, it really was bothering him.
And he kept ignoring it. And the word he uses is tolerate. So like it was the idea of you can just tolerate the suffering, in large part because he had a higher goal in the moment, which was to win that race. And so for the sake of the competition, he sidelined the sensation of the pain. Well, as you might guess, he took that all the way through the line. He ended up not winning the race, by the way. Or did he win the race? Oh, now I forget. But whatever the case may be, they ran their last mile in like 4:30 something. Like they were cranking for the last mile. And so the point being, regardless of the results, because he even says in the article the results weren't the point, he ended up tearing his Achilles in that race and could not run again for months. Could not train at all at a high level for quite a long time. So what's the point? Why did we tell that full story to set the stage here? Because as Steve Magness breaks down in the book, is this idea of like he was being tough in that moment by many objective standards. He would argue, however, that that's not true in a larger definition of the word tough. And so then in this book, he's trying to break down what it means to essentially to tackle difficult things and to deal with things like pain and discomfort and how all of those things play together.
Right. And he's a researcher. That's the part that we didn't put in his credentials. He's a science guy. So he's someone that we often will look at for some new training research and things of that nature. He's a very intelligent man, as well as being very talented in his running
and coaching. Yeah, and
his coaching.
And author of the book The Science of Running. And so like he makes the claim in that title that he's got it all the science in one book, or at least, it's a comprehensive one for sure.
So where he starts is in the misunderstanding of toughness and how often it's destructive, as Zach said in the beginning, and also romanticized as being something that doesn't turn into what we would hope for. So we see a lot of these kinds of scenarios or scenes in movies where there's an athlete that's pushing themselves to the limit. They're up till the night on a punching bag, or they're like running and like, I don't know, just there's all kinds of scenarios.
Going too hard too often,
like going
as
too
runners
hard
go.
and puking in the trash can and passing out and jello legs and tying up their hands because they have blisters if they're a gymnast. Like this idea that we need to go beyond our pain signals in order to achieve greatness.
And you get mantras from this concept like blood, sweat, and tears, and that kind of stuff that's like hardcore. If you're being hardcore, then you're really doing it. I remember a time in college that my nose had started bleeding during a track workout. Andy doesn't like me telling this story because it's kind of morbid. Well, not morbid, but it's gross. So my nose started bleeding during a track workout, and like profusely. And of course I was like, well, I'm not going to stop. I'm halfway in and I'm working out with my team, and it's like, it's time to be tough, right? So I took the blood, I wiped it off my face, and found that I had, as a result, I had a lot of blood on my hand. So I wrote the letter R on my chest in my own blood because, like Rip was my nickname, Ripley. Anyway, so that was like I was being tough, right? But really, I was bleeding profusely from the nose and should have probably stopped an aerobic cardiovascular workout, which kept the bleeding happening because my heart rate was really high. I probably should have stopped and, stopped the nosebleed. And maybe I ended up with a few reps shorter because I had to stop the workout early. But, better than like passing out potentially or some other issue that results from blood loss.
It's kind of hard to breathe when your nose is bleeding, right?
I mean, it wasn't fun, but it was really cool that I was like literally just bleeding. Okay, so that's not tough by Steve Magness' definition.
And a quote from his book, "In the name of toughness, we rationalize the absurd." We do absurd things. And we don't always look at how we will gain adaptations or how we will get fitter, but we're going to do this crazy 20 by 400 meter workout because we think that the toughness in that is going to make us great, instead of looking at actually what we need in training in order to maximize our fitness growth. And so we rationalize absurd things because we want to show that we're tough. So it almost becomes kind of like an idol. Like this toughness factor that we look to as the ideal.
And you'll hear commentary to that effect almost explicitly, those words where people will say things like, if you can handle this workout, then you're going to be something, or you're going to be able to do this thing. And it's like, this is a really hard workout. And if you can get through it, not many people get through it, that kind of stuff. And it's like, why Why would you, as a coach, have a workout that your athletes can't even do? That's stupid.
Well, the
not
few
smart.
the few athletes that do end up enduring it,
Probably
then they're like,
can't because it's appropriate for their level potentially.
But then the ones who can't, it actually does the opposite.
Exactly.
And that can cause them to either burn out or have even like some nervous system issues because they're constantly pushing themselves to the edge like that. There's another quote that there's a mentality to never show weakness, to grind it out, to play through pain. You've probably heard all these things before.
Yep.
Because it is common conversation.
No pain, no gain.
Right. Which that one is specifically rubs me the wrong way. No pain, no gain? What?
Well, because then
there doesn't have to be pain to have gains,
yeah,
guys.
then you get at this scenario where it's like, it's too easy, so it must not be helping me. Well, of course that's wrong. Depending on the kind of thing you're trying to do, Yeah.
Yeah. And this I found to be very interesting, although not the most relevant part of the conversation, but part of the research said that there is a lot of masculinity assigned but to this kind of toughness. But research shows that women quietly handle pain much better than their male counterparts.
Like in a more appropriate way, you mean? Or like just can have more pain? Because I would argue that women can actually endure greater volumes of pain than men.
It might be. I'm not really sure how they can measure that, but they show that with the same pain measures that women handle it more quietly.
Well, by design.
Maybe not screaming and yelling and I don't know.
God only knows that he created women to bear babies, not men, for a good reason. Men would never do it.
So this is another quote. Toughness based on reality is what we should be seeking, not false confidence or bluster. Because a lot of this toughness is not reality. Like it's not even something that we should do or strive for. It's not a reality. It's just to help boost a confidence, which then in turn, this is a sad part, it often leaves us more insecure.
Yeah, well, the potential for insecurity is higher, but also then the potential for catastrophe, which creates more insecurity as well. So it's really just a raw deal when we're trying to. The facade is the word that Magness uses. We'll talk about that down the road here when we get into the pillars, which we'll mention what that is here in a moment. But
fake toughness, as defined by Magness, control and power-driven, developed through fear, fueled by insecurity, and based on appearance over substance. Which I thought was an interesting list.
Amplified by public facing, like social media. Think about the concepts here. So fueled by insecurity, based on appearance or over substance. Pretty much all of these things are then further amplified.
That's true.
By our sense of what other people perceive or don't perceive.
Yeah, it makes it even more dynamic. So a lot of teams will take the strategy of the military for like Hell Week, and what they don't realize is that it was not a way to develop and train soldiers as much as it was to see if they could endure the stress that they would encounter in combat, for which they were already trained.
So they
were trained
to
endure that stress.
But
we don't want to put people in a life and death situation not knowing if they can endure that stress. Yeah. That is not the most effective way for stress inoculation, to like throw people in all at once, like as a freshman, to see what happens, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, and context matters here. So I'm entirely okay with degrees of testing one's toughness far above and beyond for things like public service in armed services and defense and such.
Because that is life and death.
Because it is. And in fact, we want those people to be able to handle that kind of stuff. But most of the time, for most of us, we're not really discussing situations that have that high of a level of concern in reality. And so that's where you get into some really interesting research. And this is not part of the book here, but just a reflection on, if you look at cultures and cultural influence on things like running, some of the things that they have found is that where there is a greater cultural pressure that is more like the life and death scenario, like if I don't succeed, then it means like, I don't have the money to feed my family, like situations like that, you tend to see a higher pain tolerance or pain endurance in those who feel like it's more of a life and death scenario, which then goes back into, by the way, when Steve Magness wrote about in Passion Paradox about the all-in mindset. When we have truly convinced ourselves that it is all or nothing, we have to have this thing, it does increase our capacity to endure pain. It's true, which is not always a good thing, as we're talking about here.
And as Magnus himself said in the blog post, he's like, this was not a very significant moment for that half marathon. But if it was, for instance, if he's in the Olympics, or it was going to be one of his last attempts, if he didn't have as much that he was looking toward moving forward, this was like it, then he would have done that again. But in retrospect, he's like, I was just kind of getting in the role of like this fitness thing, and I was looking at possibly qualifying for the Olympic trials. So if he were to go back and reevaluate, that wouldn't have been the moment to do that. So instead of putting ourselves in a frenzy like it is life and death, let's really have the cognitive awareness to put perspective on it. And that's where a lot of these conversations happen later. But I did want to mention the dangers of the improper version of toughness for runners. Heat stroke.
Oh, sure. So if it's hot out.
And sometimes we will be delusional and keep doing our runs.
Or even just because this is one of those things that you hear like in movies all the time, and every one of us just kind of smirks or rolls our eyes when they do this, where it's like, they slap the cup of water out of the athlete's hand and it's like, no water until you do this thing right. It's like, you're silly. The reason they're not doing it right is because they're dehydrated and can't do it, right? So that kind of mindset is, that's the idea here, that toughness sense that produces really bad scenarios for us.
Right.
Especially in bad conditions like that.
And there's times where damaged muscle products seep into the bloodstream. And those are two ways that people actually have died with overexertion. And then more commonly, athletes will get sick or injured when in their training because they're overdoing it. And then the psychological consequence, there's lower independence, emotional exhaustion, burnout, and fear of failure from this version of toughness. I thought it was interesting, the lower independence. I thought that was, if you're looking to have an outside measure and you're trying to control this version of toughness in your life, then you're dependent on other things rather than your internal gauges.
Yeah, and it's that old adage that Andy enjoys most, which is your training should serve you. You should not serve your training. And that's the concept here, where it's like the idea of being tough is in almost every the common definition here has everything to do with what other people are perceiving is tough, not what we need to do in a given moment. And so that's where the important contrast here. So what then, according to Magness, is a better version of the concept? What is real toughness?
Real toughness, this is a quote, is experiencing discomfort, which you will in running.
Let's be sure of that.
Leaning in, paying attention, and creating space to take thoughtful action. It's maintaining a clear head and to be able to make the appropriate decision. Toughness is navigating discomfort to make the best decision you can.
I like that definition. And one of the reasons I like it a lot is because when I'm in casual conversation with someone, one of my go-to responses when someone's sharing a difficult thing is I will say, that's tough. And I only notice after the fact that I've said it, because it's like, I've said that like 4 times in this conversation. I need to come up with a different way to respond, right? So that's kind of like one of my filler words, I guess. But the reason in that particular thing, the things that tend to strike us as difficult are those situations that require some amount of kind of like sacrificing of a thing, right? Where it's like this, I can't have the best scenario. I can't have the best option, or the thing that's happening to me is not the best possible scenario. And that's kind of an element of what Magness is discussing here, which is the idea that we're facing difficult moments, and to be tough is to make the choice that isn't always the most glorified choice. It isn't always the coolest thing on Strava or the best metric that's going to appear on your Garmin Connect. And so what it amounts to is that toughness is the combination of all these things that we have to deal with and trying to then, as Magness says, navigate that to greater effect.
I really appreciate it, especially with all of our talk about running by effort, how he was saying that distance runners, the successful ones, are able to have this true sense of toughness because in the run, they're going to have to evaluate and have a clear head about how much effort they can sustain through their run or what adjustments need to be made while being uncomfortable at some point during the run. But having that honest reflection and also not charging early on in it with unrealistic expectations. He had a lot of conversation in the book about expectations.
Yeah, and that matters so much because that tends to be where the difficulty in the decision comes from, is those prior expectations. So as we think about this, what kinds of things can we anticipate as runners dealing with, and how can we then be tough in those moments? One of the things we're going to do here in upcoming weeks, so stay tuned on the podcast because we're going to dive deep into this. Magness presents 4 pillars for toughness, for real toughness, and we're going to examine each one of those and give you opportunity to see the direct connection between what bad choices we might be inclined to make and what good choices we should make as we're contemplating how to address this concept in our training endeavors. But as we're thinking just kind of in general right now, when you're experiencing these different kinds of things, some amount of discomfort, for instance, should be tolerated. What does it look like to be tough in difficult moments where I have to make decisions that aren't always the glamorous ones? I want to give you a couple examples. So the first here is when you are having to build things up in training. And so the discomfort we most often tend to experience is just like it feels long and it takes up a lot of time. And whether it's like focus and attention, whether it's just like, the idea of I'm losing time by adding more time running, right? So in those kinds of scenarios, what we tend to feel like is the discomfort we feel in the run, we tend to attribute or can attribute to greater weight of negativity than it actually necessarily is. So it's like because I feel like I'm not sure I want to do this thing as long as I'm supposed to do this thing right now, then, well, I'm also kind of a little bit tired, so maybe I should just cut it short. Or maybe I should not do my run tomorrow because, I'm a little bit tired, and maybe that's okay to be a little bit tired as you're trying to like build things up and such. So trying to like wrestle with that kind of a moment. Where is the expectation? Where are those inputs coming from?
And there's also an analogy in the book that was about vaccination. And so do you have to have the full-blown illness in order to be able to tolerate in the future is like kind of what he was saying. And like when it comes to your race. So like I'm building up my tolerance. And this is kind of like a vaccination. I can build up my intolerance in a smaller way so that later on I have immunity to greater discomfort.
Immunity to pain. I love it.
I think that's what he was saying.
Immunity.
I hope I'm getting that right. But that makes sense to me. And I wanted to share personally, I have just started getting back into workouts after a year and a half of I had 6 months off of running, but like in addition to that, I have been just running easy. So 6 months of nothing, and then all 6 other months plus of just easy running. So I have integrated like a few steady runs, and for me, like my tolerance for discomfort is like way lower, and I know that's something I'm gonna have to build because I lose my focus, which is the concern. When I'm uncomfortable, I'm just like. I just kind of like fade back to comfortable instead of like leaning in, as Magness says, into the discomfort.
Leaning but not diving.
Leaning but not diving.
Well, let's dwell on this a second, Andy, because this is a really good barometer. Because we talk so much with runners about how we should feel at the early stages, like the first time I'm doing a steady run in a while, like Andy's saying, all this kind of stuff. And there's this really, really difficult line to find where it's like, I don't feel great, but that's okay. And how do I know that it's not great enough or too much? And so that's that idea of like, we're just kind of, we're pushing against the bubble, but we don't want to break it. You don't want to pop the bubble because that's when you fall through and anything can happen. Usually not good. So it's like you're pushing against the bubble, but as in Andy's example here, you're pushing against it to a given degree that is now, because you're pushing, not comfortable, but it has to be something that you can sustain and something that is within yourself so that you're not finding that you can't, you have to like slow down later on and things like that. And so what does it feel like? In any moment in training, it's the same idea. This is what's so important here, because the bubble just gets bigger the more you push against it in this instance, right? Your capacity to endure, but also your physical and physiological growth happen gradually. And so the bubble is always getting a little bit bigger over time. So pushing against it right now feels a certain way, but pushing against it later on kind of feels about the same, but I'm just able to do it better, aka run faster or longer at that degree of discomfort. So that's where this idea of like, it's important to understand what it feels like to be easy, like very easy. And it's important to understand what it feels like to be just a little bit uncomfortable, because those are the lines that we're constantly bouncing back and forth between. And then we start doing things with training that just, get creative in the break apart how often we're going to be uncomfortable and for how much time. So then it's something like, well, okay, for a steady run, that it's just an hour straight of being uncomfortable, right? So it has to be a kind of discomfort that you can reasonably sustain for an hour and never more, never more uncomfortable than that. But then for like something like a fartlek or some kind of interval, you're still pushing against the bubble in the same amount of pressure. But because it's so much shorter, you have more capacity because you're not going to feel it as much for as long or as early. And so then you have to kind of get that idea of like, I'm never straining. I'm never trying to punch through the bubble. I've probably exhausted the bubble analogy, haven't I?
Well,
so
it's working.
But what I'm trying to do in training is I'm trying to always just be applying that gentle amount of pressure. And you do it consistently over time, and that's what makes the bubble bigger. Not coming in with a hammer, as Magness says, as every analogy that uses tools always says, you can't do everything with just a hammer. You need more tools, right? So you have to keep that in mind in training. What does that look like? What does that feel like every day?
And why does that analogy work so well? Because the other version of toughness is just hammering down, working hard, and it's just kind of like smashing the training. Now, running requires many tools, not just a hammer. This is a quote from Steve Magness. It requires many tools, not just a hammer. Mm-hmm. So let me leave you with this before we return to this idea in another episode. This is key. Real toughness pushes us to work with our body and mind instead of against them. Do you hear that? Instead of against them. So if you feel like you're straining so hard and your head is just down and you're giving everything you can, might not be what we're looking for. To face the reality of the situation and what we can do about it, to use the feedback as information to guide us, to accept the emotions and thoughts that come into play, and to develop a flexible array of ways to respond to a challenge. Toughness is having the space to make the right choice under discomfort.
Oh.
It's a good quote.
And that is not easy.
No.
Which is why we're going to spend a little more time on this and try to unpack it further into more precise examples and situations, looking at Magness's 4 pillars of toughness. Coming soon, so stay tuned.
Coming sooner is our world of running.
Well, first up in the world of running is some coaching news. We don't always spend a lot of time talking about the coaches out there, and yet we find it very interesting. And so maybe we should spend more time talking about it.
Occasionally we do.
We do, yeah. I always feel like the coaches don't get quite enough creds for the work that they're doing. Maybe I feel that way because we coach runners. Anyway, so no, I'm kidding. All right. This one is especially interesting because it's also related to some of the things we've been covering in the NCAA lately. So Chris Zielinski was the American record holder in the 10K. He was, in fact, the first American to ever run under 27 minutes in
Wow.
10,000 meters.
I didn't realize that.
I know. Really something. At the time, there were only a handful of people in history who had ever run under 20. So, like, he was really setting the tone. And it's just fascinating because Chris Selinsky kind of came out of nowhere. He was like a steeplechaser for a while. And
you love that about him, don't you?
Well, yeah, sure, because he was good, but he wasn't, like, exceptional. And then he trains this. It was like 1 year. He trained this 1 year for 10K, thinking, I got to try something different because the steeplechase wasn't working out. He runs an American record, and then he was done after that. He kind of blew himself up, overtrained, never could quite get it back. Unfortunately, right? Because he was like, setting some interesting tone.
Was that when he was with Jerry Schumacher?
Yes, in fact.
Interesting.
Yep. And there's comments to that effect of maybe the way that he was training just wasn't quite right for Selinsky. But the point being, so he did it as a runner, at least for a time, and really at a high level. And then goes on to the coaching scene and really has had some great success as a coach. In particular, most recently, he was coaching at Florida, where we've been covering the young phenom Parker Valby, who is definitely one of the NCAA must-watch.
Yeah, she's the national runner-up at the NCAA cross-country championships, you'll remember?
Yep. Among other accolades on the track the previous year as a true freshman as well. So Parker Valby, one to watch. Now, the fact that Selinsky's leaving Florida tells you he's got to have a great opportunity because he's got good things going on there.
Yes.
So what's that great opportunity? He's going to Oregon.
He's going to Oregon, and he's going to coach with his former coach, Jerry Schumacher.
So it's not that surprising that Selinsky would take that opportunity if he got it. One is because, certainly the past connections, he's got a lot of ties to Oregon. But also, Oregon is like one of those places where if you want to really make it in the running world, especially on the coaching side of things, go to Oregon.
Well, you're right there at Hayward Field.
It's all there. It's all there.
Hayward Field is it the only like Diamond League eligible track?
I don't know about eligible, but it's the only.
It has to be a certain size.
I know. Yeah.
It might be the only stadium big enough with
in
track
the
and
U.S.
field.
Yeah. Either way, it's the only one that is qualified to host the World Championships currently. Yeah. There's other stadiums that they could make qualified, but the case may be made that it's definitely the mecca of running.
It's a great place to be.
It's great for runners, but it seems to be the case that coaches get really well connected if they're coaches at Oregon. So I think it's a great move, in terms of like career-wise and future.
He'll be the assistant coach in the track and field program and cross country.
And it should be noted that they've had a lot of changes on coaching staff in Oregon recently, and so as a consequence, it's kind of a great chance to help set some new tones as well, because he's there at the early stages of a bunch of new coaching shifts. If they have success, it's going to look good for him too, and they will have success because they're Oregon. They're always successful. Yeah,
Speaking of success, how about a marathoner crushing it on the indoor track?
Yeah,
I'm loving that. I love to hear that. Now, the story, I dug a little bit further. I linked to the article that I looked at, but he was on the track before he moved to the marathon, but he's returned now to the track, even in better form than he was previously. And who am I talking about? Phil Sessamon. And
that's a name that nobody knows.
Well, you might come to know it because if he's having this kind of success, we can assume that he's in good fitness. So he beat Jake Whiteman, our world champion
from the 1500 last summer,
in a dramatic 3,000. And this Phil Sessamon ran 7:54:34 to outkick Jake Whiteman. Outkicking Jake Whiteman is a big deal. Like so actually Jake Whiteman was ahead of him in the final lap, in the final turn. It was Phil who ended up storming on Jake Whiteman, which that is surprising to have like someone who's a marathon specialist outkick the 1,500 meter world champion. I don't know if you can call him a
marathon specialist. He's only been running marathons for like 18 months.
Okay, well, that's what he seems to have the best success in so far.
Well, he was 7th in the London Marathon in 2021. So, yes.
And that was his debut. His debut was 7th in the London Marathon in 2:12:58.
That's not a bad debut.
That's a great
What's
debut.
he been doing prior to...
So this is what Wikipedia says, and I want to change the page Can you do that? Can like the public change the page?
I don't know how that
I
works
would
anymore.
like to, because I don't like his bio. I don't think it's very nice. On his Wikipedia page, it says Sessamon was famous throughout the athletics community for starting a track season in strong form and frequently falling apart and fading out by August, resulting in lackluster performances.
Wow.
Sessamon switched to the road in 2020. So this man who would get burnt out on track is now one of the best marathoners.
Where's he from? What's his nationality?
That's a great question. I'll find out while you're
the
talking.
case may be made, and I have to say it because this is what everyone's going to say in rebuttal, is we're talking about a January indoor track race. So this is like preseason. Jake Whiteman by no means is trying to focus on that race for anything more than just a chance to get out and move fast. And he is not trained for optimization right now. So the fact that someone outkicks him late stages of a race doesn't really mean much ultimately. But nonetheless, it's impressive what Phil did. It doesn't really like concern me about what Whiteman did.
No, it doesn't concern me, but
it's
it kind of makes me put Sessamon on my radar.
Sure.
You know, and so he's British. To answer that question, I looked that up while we were discussing.
Very nice.
But I think that is just a kind of a cool thing, and it might be that he needed this marathon training to become a better track runner. It's possible. Just putting it out there. Marathon training's pretty great.
Is that was that a personal best time for him on the track?
His Wikipedia page is very, very slim.
Not terribly clear. Okay. Well, the case is excellent nonetheless for evidence of good fast running always tends to show good fast running. So whether that means he's just kind of prepping for another marathon season or he's going to try his hand back at the track for a little while, it'll be fun.
We'll see.
Well, hopefully we will see.
Mm-hmm. Great performances continue. Courtney DeWalter won the Bandera 100K, which is no surprise given her track record, or should I say ultra record?
Trail record.
Trail record. She was 6th overall. So not only was she first woman, but she was 6th overall,
ahead of her. Very nice.
Which is a very competitive race. And she was the first woman to ever break 9 hours in a new course record time of 8:59:37.
Whoa.
And I just
snuck under 9 hours.
Yeah,
That's
I just want to keep Courtney DeWalter in our world of running when there's relevance, because she's been the greatest ultra runner that we've seen. So it's exciting to see.
It's exciting. It's always good. Well, with that, we have little else to say about the world of running at the moment, but we have a lot more to say about a lot of things coming soon.
Milrose Games is coming up. Ooh.
We've got exciting things to report on the track as the indoor season starts to ramp up, which is always fun to do. And we've also got some great content lined up for you. We really wanted to try to focus here in the coming months on some things that we can kind of dive deep into a few layers. And so we're going to look at this toughness concept with Steve Magness' work. We're going to look at things like some of the recovery methods and research behind them, which you are going to be very excited about that, and have some interviews potentially in the near future as well to examine some of these things with some experts too. Yeah. We're very excited about all the things that we are going to say in your ears. But we're also excited about the interactions with you. And as you know, that's the most important thing about all of what we do. And we have many ways to accomplish that. So if you have questions for the podcast, you submit those, or certainly just comment on the places like the social medias or the YouTubes or whatever those are called. And if you feel like you need added layers of support and you're looking for something like, I don't know exactly what to do to prepare for this training this season, but need a little bit of like custom guidance on some of that, many have found in the recent past some added benefit from our custom training plans, partly because we can build those in a matter of days, few of them, from the moment you put together the information in the form. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, it takes a few minutes to complete the form and you get a customized plan built right for you with explanation of how best to implement it. And it only takes about 2 days to turn it around. So it's worth pursuing at AtoZrunning.com/coaching.
Thank you all for joining us. We hope that those on YouTube enjoyed our new background. There'll be more added to it most likely as well. So things are looking good for 2023. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.